Ready? Good evening and welcome. Good evening and welcome. It's amazing, the volume at our 6 o'clock meeting was just booming through here, and the extra attendance tonight makes it a little quieter. I hope people at the back can hear, because we have speakers on the other side, but it always takes a bit of an adjustment. Welcome. I'm glad to see so many people out to council meetings, September 5th, 2018, and the first item is always to call the meeting to order and a motion to adopt. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? We have a very large agenda this evening. It's 595 pages, plus some correspondence that came in today, throwing it well over 600. For those of us going to SCRD tomorrow, it's 380 some odd pages, I think, tomorrow. As you know, there's an election going on, and one of the candidates is running as mayor under the banner Courage to Lead. And one of the wags yesterday, after looking at this agenda, said she should change to Courage to Read. So for those who have the courage to read, this is the place to be. 600 pages tonight. Thank you very much for being here. We have two delegations. The first is, and the declaration of conflict. Call to order, and we always ask if those who do have a conflict to let us know and at the right time recuse themselves. Councillor Shanks reminded me, because when we get to the planning department, he will have one. Okay. And Councillor Lutz on the Marine Way. So you'll see two councillors leaving at different times because of potential conflicts or perception of bias. 3.1, Debbie Ferguson, Sunshine Coast Lions Housing Society, regarding the Green Court. Thank you very much for being here, and that works good.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the proposed Green Court project. I'm Debbie Ferguson. I'm the chair of the building committee for Sunshine Coast Lions Housing Society. Thank you. Our purpose in making this presentation to you is to elaborate on the need for the proposed project and to explain some of the design choices that we have made to date in our project planning. So I'd like to begin with a brief background on the Lions Housing Society. We became a registered nonprofit organization in 2006, but we have owned and operated the Green Court Affordable Rental Housing Complex for seniors since the late 1970s. We assumed ownership from the original founding society when their members felt that they needed an organization that could better provide continuity of operation. The members and board of the Lions Housing Society are all volunteers. We are a small organization, and yet we own and operate the largest nonprofit affordable seniors rental housing complex on the Sunshine Coast, not to mention the only such housing in the district of Sechelt. We could not do so without the help of our funding partners, BC Housing and CMHC, support in the past from the district of Sechelt, and our two dedicated paid employees at Green Court. So, in 2012, we completed construction on the Jack Nelson building at Green Court, which replaced the first building built on the site in the late 1960s. Since then, we've been planning to replace the next two oldest buildings on the site, referred to as the cottages, which are single-story buildings with studio units built in the 1970s. We've been rehousing the 29 tenants living in the cottages gradually as space has become available in the other three buildings. We now have only 3 tenants left to rehouse from the cottages. The need for affordable seniors rental housing has escalated significantly during our planning period, and we have approximately 200 people on our waiting list, many of whom qualify for rent geared to income or deep subsidy housing. The Society is intent on providing as many new units as possible on the Green Court site to accommodate as many low-income seniors as we can. In addition to housing seniors needing affordable rent, we are partnering with Sunshine Coast Association for Community Living to provide up to 6 suites in the Arbutus building for persons with developmental disabilities. This slide shows the proposed footprint of the Arbutus building, the new building, in the upper right corner. It's been very carefully calculated to maximize the space available to us for building while maintaining green space, traffic and fire safety routes, walkability for the tenants, and parking. In order to increase the available footprint area, the Society decided to remove the Lions Hall building as well as the cottages and integrate smaller meeting space into the ground floor of the Arbutus building as an alternative. It is important to the Society that we cultivate a village culture for our senior tenants. All of the buildings will have main entrances facing into the center of the complex, where the main green space will also be situated and hopefully will become a gathering place for the tenants. We believe that seniors who feel vulnerable will feel more secure within a village-style complex. This slide shows the massing and height of the proposed building looking toward Ocean Avenue from Hackett Park. Naturally, it's not going to be a white building like that. The Jack Nelson building is shown on the left, and it is 1 story less than the proposed Arbutus building. It is our intent in the next design phase to integrate the Arbutus building with the Jack Nelson building as much as possible through the use of roof line and exterior colors and materials. This view of the proposed Arbutus building is looking east along Ocean Avenue, again with Jack Nelson on the left. By aligning the 2 buildings along Ocean with walkways from the street between the buildings into the complex, we are promoting the village concept and utilizing the property footprint to its fullest. And this is the view of the proposed building looking west along Ocean Avenue at the corner of Medusa. We intend to soften the exterior effect of a 5-story building through the use of differing colors and materials on the various levels. We will also look at roof line and balconies in that regard in the final design. Why are we building a 5-story building instead of another 4-story building, or even a 3-story building? Quite simply due to need. We need as many new rental units now for vulnerable seniors on limited income as we can possibly afford to build. And we can only build up. We have no more land available for us to build outward. We're also putting in underground parking at considerable additional cost instead of above-ground parking in order to maximize the number of suites we can build. Finally, we have designated the building so that the units are stacked and each floor is replicated, one above the other. We've done this in order to pursue a modular style of building, which we hope will save us time and money with ever-escalating construction costs. Final slide, what do we need? We very much appreciate that the Planning and Community Development Department staff, outside referral agencies, and the PCD committee have been helpful and positive regarding moving this project forward. And we sincerely hope the Council will agree and continue the momentum. We are about to submit our final funding proposal to BC Housing under the new Community Housing Fund. Any municipal support, particularly support from Council in the form of the requested zoning bylaw amendment being passed, and waiver of development cost charges will greatly assist our proposal as it is being evaluated against other funding proposals from other municipalities. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Before you leave, just in case there's council questions or clarifications, it was a very clear presentation, but you never know. Councillor Inkster.
Thank you. Just Debbie, just a couple of things. One, it's about time to see this. Second of all, you did mention the 55 rule. Will there be special circumstances and or special rules regarding ever in place to allow for something that deviates from that set age?
I would say generally, no, that's not our philosophy, except for the fact that the people with the developmental disabilities will not be subject to the 55 plus. We've discussed with SCACL the fact that they actually have a number of clients who are over 55 with developmental disabilities. We would like to seek to place them first in our complex if we can, but we are not limited when we have persons with disabilities as to age.
Okay, good.
Any other comments or questions? Then we'll just thank you, and we'll get to that as a business item a little later on, and the direct requests we'll consider in another setting. There are 4, 5 chairs at the front here for people who, are going to be here for a while, or if you would like to come, and there's actually a few chairs scattered in the place, so those who are standing and might want to consider. It's like church, we don't take up a collection, but you can come to the front if you'd like. And the second delegation this evening is Janet McIntosh from St. Hilda's Church. Yeah, it is church.
Thank you. My name is Janet McIntosh, representing St. Hilda's Anglican Church. Also with me today is Murray Peterson, and I will be speaking for about 5 minutes, and then he will be speaking for about 5 minutes as well, too. Okay. So what I am simply bringing is information to Council as to briefly go on what happened to St. Hilda's, where it's at right now, and a little bit into the future. So what began in June of 2017 was a water leak in a corner of the church building that was discovered, and at that point in time we were told it would cost us approximately $150,000 to fix it. And we all gasped at $150,000, but carried on. And then by November 2017, as further and further problems came to light, extensive structural deficiencies were identified, and at that point the cost was now $900,000. And the church voted in January, I believe it was, to go ahead and proceed with the fixing, and that started in February of 2018. By May of 2018, further issues were uncovered, specifically plumbing and wiring issues, and at that point, Spaney Developments, who was the contractor doing all of the work, it was now up to $1.1 million. In August 2018, adding in other costs such as engineering and architecture, consultants, insurance, permitting, and fundraising costs. Our latest is we're now at $1.3 million. So far, revenue raised, we've got our sign that's on the corner of the property. We're at approximately the $610,000 mark. That's money in the bank that has been spent. We have future revenues promised through pledges from the members of our church, right now of $242,600. We're continuing our fundraising efforts, and this isn't a complete list by any stretch of the imagination, which include a raffle, ticket sales, a cookbook sale, bake sale, bottles and cans return, that kind of thing. We've applied for different grants. One is through the Anglican Foundation of Canada for an amount of $25,000. That is a 2-stage process. It's past the first stage, which is going through the diocese in Vancouver, and the organization is headquartered in Montreal, and they will be meeting this month, and we will know by the end of September if we will be successful in that grant. Another one that we have applied for is a BC Gaming grant, and this is a capital grant. And BC Gaming only started doing capital grants last year, and it's a 3-year project, and I think they'll probably see where it goes after 2019. That is an application for $250,000, and the results will be known to us by the end of October of this year. And then the third grant that's been applied for is the Sunshine Coast Community Forest Legacy Grant in the amount of $200,000, and that was submitted at the end of June. So far, there's no deadline date that the community forest has given for this particular go-round, but I wanted to show on record that we have made that application, which goes through the community forest first before it comes before the District of Sechelt's own committee. We have received a privately granted loan of $300,000, which has to be paid back, and we've already gone through that as well too. And we have an interim loan that has been given to us by the Anglican Church of Canada for $200,000, and negotiations are in process. They haven't been finalized for a total of a $500,000 loan, which is not on top of the 200, it includes that $200,000. November 4th has been chosen as the date to rededicate St. Hilda's Anglican Church. The Archbishop from Vancouver will be present that day for the church service. So if you've driven by, the scaffolding is all down finally. The siding is almost complete. They're doing some touch-ups, and inside the main painting is finished. Again, touch-ups, cleaning of the carpets, cleaning of and bringing back the grand piano. The organ is been shrouded in a box for almost a year. And we're looking at a tentative date, this hasn't been firmed up yet, of November the 18th to have an open house where we welcome the public as well as all of the donors that have presented very generously to us. And Murray is going to talk about the next phase, and before I leave, I just wanted to let everybody know that the next phase doesn't happen until this phase is finished and paid for. All right. Do you have any questions of me, or do you want to wait till we're all finished?
Let's just check. I think we probably just have thanks that the daunting challenge that you and the congregation proceeded through must have been very difficult the first couple of times you looked at that.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, and we'll just listen to the next. Murray.
Thanks very much. I'm Murray Peterson. I'm the chair of what we call our revisioning team, looking at what it might be the next phase for St. Hilda's. It's been very interesting living with this congregation. When they were told we're looking at a $900,000 plus cost to do the remediation of the sanctuary, there were some choices people could make. We could take the building down, rebuild completely. We could simply remediate the sanctuary, or we could pick up on one of our parishioners' ideas in the past to do some additional development on the property. And it was interesting, the congregation said, if we're going to redo the sanctuary, which they wanted to do, because people have a lot of connection with that building, they also wanted to give back to the community by developing the property in a variety of ways. And some of the suggestions that they had was to develop a small housing project, which could be for seniors, it could be for families, it could be for a variety of people. And I think in a lot of ways they wanted to see a sort of mixed group of residents. Also to develop a larger meeting space, which could be available to the community for performance, for meetings, for whatever, including perhaps a community kitchen and perhaps a community garden as well. So these are not people who are saying, poor us, we have to raise a ton of money in order to rebuild the sanctuary, but what can we do to help make the community better? So that's where we're going. We've recently, during the summer, we interviewed 3 local consultants who have experience with community development, with housing, and social issues as well. We interviewed each of them separately, and we're quite delighted when in each of the interviews, each of them, and we're talking about a small community here, so everybody knows everybody, they were certainly aware of each other's involvement with us. And in fact, what they've decided to do is work as a team to help us do a feasibility study for what can happen with that property. Of course, then the question is, how do you pay consultants when you don't have any money and you are looking at a $900,000 bill. Interestingly enough, the Diocese of New Westminster has an annual grant for parish development. We approach them to say, we're looking at an opportunity to help develop the parish. That is the congregation, not necessarily the building, because they don't fund that sort of thing. And we've been given some fairly positive indication that there's a very good possibility that we will get a grant of about $20,000, which would then fund this feasibility study. That money won't come to us if we're successful. It won't come to us until January of the new year. But that doesn't seem to faze the three consultants that we're working with, and they're quite happy to continue along in the hopes that the money will actually come through. So we've got some very positive plans for the future, and looking forward to that kind of development.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure the community is looking forward to that as well. Any questions, comments? No, we really appreciate that, and knowing that you looked at what was a very daunting challenge, and it seems to have come out on the positive side to say, how can we actually make things better? I'd actually like to thank both delegations that came this evening. To have two delegations on significant issues and have them both done in 20 minutes speaks to the quality of those presentations. So thank you very much for both of those. We'll move on to our agenda, and if people want a chance to leave, this is a good time, but we'll have first the adoption of minutes of previous council meetings. The minutes of the 7 p.m. regular council meeting of August 1st, 2018, pages 7 to 18. First, a motion to receive and adopt. Thank you, Councillor Wright and Mueller. And any errors or omissions that people saw in those minutes? And if there's nothing marked, then I'll say all those in favor of adoption. And that's carried. And then we look at the minutes of the 1:30 p.m. special council meeting of August 15th. A one-page. Motion to receive and adopt. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? It's carried. And any business arising from either of those minutes? No business arising. We can move then to our committee minutes and reports. And we start with the minutes of the Finance, Culture, and Economic Development meeting of Wednesday, August 8th. And that's pages 21 through to 24. First, a motion to receive. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Mueller. Any errors or omissions or any of those recommendations you'd like to see pulled out for special consideration before we move recommendations? If there's no errors and no recommendations to pull out, I'd look for a motion to receive the recommendations from Wednesday, August 8th, recommendations 1 through 7. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Mueller seconding. All those in favor? And that's carried. Probably the most important part of that meeting was discussion of funding for Sunshine Coast tourism, but also for the solid waste collection for homes and manufactured home parks. There's a very small subset of people there that are on provincial or federal assistance, and we found a way to ensure that the new levies and charges for garbage pickup don't adversely affect those people. Moving then to the minutes of the Planning and Community Development meeting, item 7.2, and this is page 25 to 34. First, a motion to receive. Thank you. Seconded. Any errors or omissions, and there are some planning meetings, we'll pull out recommendation 11, 12, and 13, 14. Anything else that needs special consideration? If there's no errors or omissions, I'll look then for a motion to adopt from the Planning Committee. Councillor Shanks.
Yes, I wish that immediately before recommendation number 12, it indicates that I recused myself, but for the wrong reason. The reason actually was a long-time association with those societies in connection with the Lions Club and the Lions Housing Society. It wasn't that I was a member of the society.
Okay, we'll start with that as an amendment to the minutes then, just to note. I don't think we need to vote on it. When we vote to accept the other recommendations, we'll amend that comment. It wasn't one of the resolutions, but you've noted that already. Good. So then I'd look for a motion to adopt recommendations 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And then after the Lions, 15, 16, 17 through to 2021. Councillor Mueller, thank you. Second, any discussion of any of those? All those in favor? Those are carried, and we'll give Councillor Shanks an opportunity to recuse himself. The conflict of interest rules are complicated for councillors, but generally it's a self-declared concept. I mean, only individuals know their own business dealings. And in Councillor Shanks' case, this is an abundance of caution. There's not a direct financial conflict, but a potential for a perception of bias because he has been such a long-standing member of the Lions and Green Court work. So that leaves us to turn to recommendations 12, 13, and 14. Motion to adopt. Thank you, Councillor Mueller and Councillor Seegers. Any discussion of those three? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously, and we'll come back a little later to the actual zoning bylaw amendment. So first step is all good. Yes, and we should tell Councillor Shanks. I think he's hiding in the back. There he is. He must have timed it, knowing that we would only take a moment or two. And we can turn to the minutes of the Public Works, Parks and Environment Committee from Wednesday, August 22nd. This is pages 35 to 37. Motion to receive and adopt, Councillor Lutz and Councillor Mueller. Any errors or omissions? Anything from that committee? And then, if not, a motion to receive and adopt recommendations 2 through 5. Thank you. And direct Councillor Mueller, Councillor Wright, all those in favor? And that's carried. Under bylaws for first reading and another opportunity to recuse yourself. Maybe you can go outside and get the fresh air this time. This may take a few more minutes because there will be a report. Item 8.1, and if we could first have a motion to receive the report. Councillor Lutz and Seeger second. All those in favor? And would I turn to the director for a report because the community planner isn't here. Ms. Corbett.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. I'd also like to thank Ms. Ferguson for doing a much more coherent report than mine is, so I can save you some time here. So what is in front of us is application for 2 amendments. One for the OCP to allow an increase in the maximum density allowed, and an amendment to the zoning bylaw to establish a new CD zone, which gives effect to this development and allows the increase in density and height. So this is the proposal. It's to construct 104 units of affordable seniors housing. It's a 5-story apartment with common facilities, the lobby, office, laundry, and hallways, or includes the hall, as was mentioned, incorporating that as to a meeting space. And it involves the removal of the 29 bungalow units that are along Ocean Avenue. So this was and the picture below, that was the original proposal that was in place for a central court area attached to a 3-story unit. The challenges, as was mentioned, is that when you net out the 29 bungalow units, this particular proposal only gave an increase of about 8 units. So financially was not feasible to do. And moving to the 5-story allows that ability to make it both financially feasible, but also to meet an incredible demand. So in terms of the site context, just had some pictures of the area just to give a sense of what's in place right now and where this development will go. So this is essentially the courtyard between the 2 bungalow buildings. This is essentially the development site for the 5-story building. This is the area, so that is on the one side, that is the hall that is going to be replaced and incorporated into the development. As was mentioned, that just gives a little more room both for access and for expanding that building. The access point on the other side coming off Medusa remains, and that provides access throughout the entire site. This gives a sense of the existing parking that is against the existing 4-story building that remains in place, and that access remains. And then this is a photo just looking up Ocean Avenue, which gives you a sense of what the streetscape is there. It also shows up the bus bay that is in place there, so provides really easy access into that development for Handy Dart and for transit and drop-off. And when we look at official community plan amendments, there's a number of criteria that are built into the OCP to justify whether something like this is warranted. In addition to looking at the basics of the development, the density, the height, the massing, can it be serviced, is there capacity, we also look at community need. I think that argument has been made very clearly that there certainly is a very high demand here for both affordable rental and for seniors housing. That was all discussed. This is the location. The OCP designation is multifamily mixed residential, and there is a split zoning on the site. Part of it is under R4, and the building in question in the existing building is under CD26. So the effect of this amendment would be to put the entire area under one comprehensive development zone to give effect to the new building. It doesn't in any way affect the existing densities or the configuration. It's not giving additional density to those other areas, but it puts it under one comprehensive zone for them. And the reason being is that a lot of the access is shared, the parking is shared, and so it provides an opportunity to treat it as more of a complex. This is the current density on the site, the 4-story building being the 65-unit building, and then the 2 cottages. So the R4 site that is on the western side of the complex, under the zoning, it allows 52 units. They have 46 in place right now. The CD26 area allows 102 units under their zoning. They currently have 94 in that area. And the overall complex allowing 154. And that is the density. So what is proposed is providing the new building. It's 104 units. The net is 75 units by the time they remove the bungalows. And that requires a density increase to provide for this is 175 units per hectare, hence why we need the OCP amendment to give it effect. This is the difference between the 2 comprehensive development zone configurations. It requires a slight change to their access off Medusa. I mean, the access stays the same, just the configuration around it alters because of the removal of the meeting hall. But it does provide very easy access, the way they've got the building entrances to provide very accessible access into the lobbies where the elevators are. And I'll go through more of the site plan of the individual areas. through that. And that was the effect. So here's the difference in terms of the zoning configurations. So we're providing 61 additional units on this site. And then the increase in density, which would provide 50 units per hectare increase through the OCP amendment. And then an increase in the height to allow for the increase to the 5 stories at 17.5 meters. So it's an additional story higher than the existing building and what's allowed under the zoning. So that is the effect of the 2 amendments. That is the massing, and as mentioned, it will not be a white building. This was a building that was done in Vancouver by the same architects who are working on this particular structure, and showed this development. We went through their zoning and their design configurations. So they did a really interesting job here. This is a 5-story building, of utilizing the materials and differences in color to kind of bring that 5th floor down to make it read a little bit more like a 4. So it integrated fairly well, and that kind of color scheme and the design would fit well with the existing building. So it just integrates the site a little bit better. This is standing from the sidewalk right by one of the cottages, looking into across the road onto Bundusa. So this is what the neighbors would see, or the view from the new building. So it was one of our concerns was certainly the interface with Medusa. It does go down to a lot of those homes are at 1 story. Interestingly, there's a lot of vegetation, a lot of coverage in a lot of those particular buildings. We did have the applicants do a shadow study on it. That information will come back in more detail at the development permit stage. But that would be the one outlying issue, is just, yes, it's a 5-story building and a little more challenging interface at that location. That is the shadow study. So I have to check my notes because I can't read that. Just to find which equinox the first one is. I believe that is the spring one in the first one, in the spring equinox. And so you can see where there's shadowing crosses in certain areas from the new building. The middle one is the summer equinox. So not quite as much in the summer, and of course in the winter. It's interesting that they did the one at 4 p.m. on a winter day, so everything is shadowed. We all share in that configuration. So it does show some shadowing, but most of it doesn't cross the road to a great degree. It's hitting onto the front lawns, but not onto the homes. When we get to the DP stage, we'll provide that in color for you and better information, so you have that in your package. This is as mentioned, one of the concerns when we were looking at the interface with Medusa, questioned whether we could possibly see it terraced or stepped back in any way. This is a modular building. It makes a significant difference in cost and constructability. So very set footprint in there which would make that very challenging, if not financially impossible to do. The things that guide that particular development as well, the hallways, the elevator shafts, that sort of thing that are in place. So stepping the building back was not going to be possible. Most of the units in place are 1 bedroom. There is that darker blue is a 2-bedroom, and so on each floor there's that opportunity for couples, and just provide some additional space. Most of the units around are between, I believe, 54 meters square and 77, and for those of you who can't convert either, it's between about 525 square feet and 825-ish on the 2-bedroom. Okay. In terms of parking, They were actually over the parking standard on the existing building. When we apply the standard for seniors and assisted living, which is 1 space per 4 units, what they require on the full site is 54. They already have that amount. There will be 70 on the full site, as well as 1 loading space. So quite a bit in that existing parking that is along the edge of the southern part of the building remains. We looked at a number of technical considerations around the serviceability of the site. Given that it's an OCP amendment, we checked it against the liquid waste management, the solid waste management plan, and the financial plan, and there were no concerns raised in that regard. We did have meetings with our fire department around the 5-story building and were there any issues, and they are fine with that. Traffic impact is very minimal given both the demographics of that population and the income level. So not expecting much of a traffic impact, and certainly non-peak period. There will be requirements for some improvements to the frontage, mainly sidewalk improvements and some lighting under bylaw 430. As mentioned in your report, there were some recommendations from engineering for some additional improvements along the sidewalk, streetlights, and the intersection just outside here at Ocean and Cowrie. That will be discussed in more detail. It proceeds to 3rd reading. Certainly it has been identified by the applicant that while that would certainly improve conditions for their tenants, it does certainly add cost, and it will be something we'll need to have further discussion on. So in summary, we are recommending that this be given 1st reading and move to a public hearing. It's certainly a well-located development relative to services, shops, and parks. It's a compact development. It achieves much-needed affordable rental housing for seniors, and the servicing capacities are sufficient to support this development. So the recommendations, they are in more detail in the report around the other wording in there. It just doesn't fit on my PowerPoint. So recommendations being that you give 1st reading to the OCP amendment, number 492/2018, and forward to public hearing. And with regard to the zoning bylaw amendment, that it also be given 1st reading and submitted to public hearing. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And I'll first turn it to council to see if there's questions and comments. And I will say to the public, it's been noted to me very, very forcefully that a screen behind us would make things much better for those that are actually attending. So, and that was done fairly recently, and we'll be looking, if we want, we'll be looking at that in terms of finances, how we can actually make it. If we get 70 people to come out to a meeting and then you can't see anything, it's not very good. Councillor Inkster.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question of staff. One thing is the report was fairly comprehensive, and it answers a lot of questions that council would have, I'm sure the public. You put a neat graphic up there of shading, which is, and shadowing, I guess we'll call it. Mm-hmm. And it's something that people ask when larger buildings are proposed. I just wanted to ask, the diagrams that you placed, the number of boxes, is that the limit then, basically, to the shading, or that would be the effect of the building, basically, as presented? Is that the size of the boxes? In terms of
basically the maximum shadowing? Yes, they usually, when they're doing shadowing studies, they'll do it at 3 to 4 different points to get the maximum amount that you would see when the sun is at the lowest hitting that building. So it will show the maximum.
So it shows the maximum. So
yes.
The buildings that are in the existing building, in the existing complex, will have some effect, and there will be some minimal effect on the street side next to Hackett Park.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So they look at 3 different time frames. So the AM directly at noon, where you'd have the least, and then around 4 o'clock where you get the most in terms of low light.
Wow, and the fact that Hackett Park's on one side too basically negates that as a shadowing issue. It's a good diagram, thanks for that.
Any other questions of staff? Councillor Seegers?
Thank you. Okay, on, as part of the recommendations, you've got some options, 2A and B. And in your presentation, you mentioned that the sidewalk and the pedestrian control light and crosswalks, et cetera, could be addressed down the road. So they wouldn't necessarily need to come forward now, but they are on radar for staff.
They are on the radar, so under the options on number 2, those are the ones that would be over and above bylaw 430 requirements, so beyond the frontage requirements. And so that when we move to, prior to third reading, to consider if that should come into a recommendation.
Okay.
If that would be on the applicant to do, or if there would be another option to provide that.
Okay, on page 46, under accessibility improvements, these are actually mentioned, and I know that they've come forward from the Accessibility Advisory Committee and by the current residents of
Yes.
Greencourt.
Yeah.
I know I've been stopped a few times by some of the residents saying, we want a sidewalk on the other side of the street. And we do know that there was somebody actually killed out here at this corner. So these are issues. So we do want them to be addressed going forward. And then Debbie talked about the development cost charges. I noticed on page 47, once the housing agreement is in place, at that point we could potentially look at that, but not before?
That's correct. As part of the DCC bylaw in there, the director has the ability to waive the DCCs, but only if the development is under a housing agreement.
Okay. And then finally on page 48, under the public information meeting,
Yes.
indicates that it's recommended another public information meeting be held to present the current. Is that still in as a request from staff, or would we be looking at just doing first reading and going to public hearing?
The option would be council on that if they felt that they needed additional information. They did do 2, as mentioned, they did do 2 meetings back in 2017. The thought was that some time has passed. Would there need to be another one? If it's sufficient to go to public hearing, we can certainly do that.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you for raising those, and I think we should be thinking of the last one, perhaps, though I don't, it's been a fairly widely known project, so I suspect that the public hearing wouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, and there would be enough information before that. Any other questions from councillors? Clarifications? If not, Councillor Mueller?
Yeah, I just had a further question about the issue of waiving or reducing development cost charges. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on that one.
So there's provision under our bylaw for development cost charges that the district can waive the charges on very specific projects, particularly those, so it's under a housing agreement, something that would have a significant community impact or community benefit. There's provision to be able to do that, to reduce the financial load on something that would be either usually in a nonprofit. But it has to be under a housing agreement, under our particular bylaw.
And that's a motion of council to do that?
It's in the bylaw itself that would, did you want to elaborate?
The bylaw that was adopted, I believe, in 2017, in the spring of 2017, includes that clause that for affordable housing projects where there is a housing agreement for those units that are under the affordable housing agreement, that the director has the opportunity to evaluate whether to waive them or to, in their entirety, or to change them. So it's a delegation to staff.
So it would actually be a staff decision?
Yes.
Or it could be. And I guess if it went a way that the community didn't like, it could be appealed to council.
Correct.
Okay. Interesting. I remember putting it in the bylaw, and it was an important part, but I wasn't sure of the process, as Councillor Mueller's pointing out. I think some of us might have thought that it would always be a council decision, but I can see why it was staff if they've done that. Councillor, are you concluded, Councillor Mueller?
I am.
That's good. And then Councillor Inkster, and then Councillor Seegers.
Historically, it's important to note that the original building that's well used over there, and it's quite a nice building, was given those kinds of benefits from the District of Sechelt. And it could be argued by many that if the District of Sechelt hadn't done that, that building wouldn't have been built. So it's something to keep in mind as we go forward.
The original, or the one that, the four-story? The four-story. Thank you. And Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. When you're talking about a housing agreement, you're indicating that it is affordable rental housing, and they must stay as rentals. It's not for affordable purchase, but affordable rentals.
That's correct, and the housing agreement has to be adopted by you through bylaw. So you have that opportunity to review the conditions in that.
So just to make sure the process is clear, the applicant would make a direct application for a waiver of DCCs when they developed a housing agreement, and then the housing agreement would come to council for adoption, and then the director, you, would make a decision about the waiving of DCCs at that time, looking at the housing agreement and council's support or not. And then if there was any decision that didn't go a certain way, it could come back to council as an appeal. Good. Okay. Anything else on that? Councillor Lutz. And then we'll try and get us into the recommendations here.
When we talk about waiving those, would that include the cost of making changes at the intersection?
Through the chair, no, not necessarily, unless it's under the DCC charges. So that would be on most of those. It's an extended service, so it wouldn't fall under DCCs. It would be additional charge.
And the decision to require those extras that the engineering so kindly put forward as a request, where's that resolved? In discussions with the applicant, or at the director's level, or between two directors, engineering and planning?
We usually address those as just part of the ongoing through our development review committees. And so a final proposal comes prior to the adoption. Most of it does happen between the applicant in those cases. It does take on a bit of a different conversation when it is a nonprofit. I don't think there's any question that those improvements are much needed. I think the question will be how is it best funded, given this type of project. So we will have a recommendation on that prior to third for council to consider.
And Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, that I'm glad that's been brought up a couple times, because that would be an interesting discussion with staff and potentially with council, because I'm sure that the group putting this forward, the Lions Society group, knows based on the clientele and the clients that they'll have in the building that there may be a need for some sort of aid crossing the road here, as has been indicated by a couple of our community members already. So I'm sure the group, the Lions group, does understand the need for some discussion in that area to allow their clients 55 and above and those with disabilities to cross that road easier. Thanks.
Okay, if we can turn to the recommendations, which are on page 38. I'd like to do them in groups. I'd like to start with the second recommendation on its own. So if somebody could move the second recommendation, Councillor Lutz and Councillor Mueller. And I would just like to affirm before we voted on that to look to staff, and it was in your presentation, but just to confirm that we have examined our District of Sechelt's current financial plan with this project, the Sunshine Coast Regional District Solid Waste Management Plan, and our District of Sechelt 2000 Liquid Waste Management Plan, and there was no impediments or no conflicts with any of those three? Okay, thank you very much. Then turning to council, if any discussion of recommendation 2? Councillor Mueller?
Yeah, I wanted to make sure, as you just did, that the financial plan in particular is paid close attention to, especially in the future if we're going to be entertaining the thought of a DCC relaxation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Then I'll look to a vote. All those in favor of recommendation 2? Any opposed? That's carried. And then the recommendation 3, which is to refer this to a public hearing, moved by Councillor Mueller, Councillor Inkster seconding. I don't think there's anything to clarify on a public hearing, so all those in favor of a public hearing? Any opposed? That's carried. And then we can do recommendations 4 and 5 together. Recommendation 4 is first reading for the OCP amendment bylaw, and recommendation 5 is first reading to the zoning bylaw amendment. Councillor Seegers is moving both of those, and Councillor Lutz seconding. Any discussion of those two? All those in favor? Any opposed? Step 1 concluded. I want to thank all of those in yellow shirts who came out in solidarity with the Lions. At first, we didn't know why you were here. I wasn't sure if it was the Fastball Association, but and we then move to item 8.1B, which is the actual bylaw, number 49224, 2018, Sunshine Coast Lions Housing Society, Green Court, being a bylaw to amend District of Sechelt Official Community Plan Bylaw number 492, 2010, and that is read a first time and moved by Councillor Seegers and Wright. And all those in favor? And that's carried unanimously. And item 8.1C is the actual zoning bylaw, bylaw number 25296, 2018, Sunshine Coast Lions Housing Society, Green Court, being a bylaw to amend District of Sechelt zoning bylaw number 25, 1987. And first reading of that is moved by Councillor Inkster and Councillor Lutz. And all those in favor? That's carried. So all of those process steps done. If you wanted to leave, we'll give you a minute, unless you want. It's going to be very entertaining. We've got a council procedure bylaw, we've got a Marine Way, and a few other things. So your choice. But oh, and Councillor Shanks, please, if somebody could bring Councillor Shanks back. He's probably gone to sleep. And thank you, Councillor Shanks, for your abundance of caution and for not influencing us in our decision there. Okay. Yeah, and there's a few more seats forward for those that are in for the long haul. Item 8.2. This is our council procedure bylaw number 568, 2018. And I'll start with a motion to receive the report. Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz, all those in favor? And would the corporate officer like to speak to this one? We've seen it once already, but there's been a little bit of correspondence and the odd thing coming up.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just one thing, or as noted in the staff report, the bylaw was presented to Council at its August 1st meeting, and it received three readings. Since that time, it's been drawn to my attention that there's a typo on page 71 of your agenda, and it's actually section 15, bracket 3 of the bylaw. And I think what happened is when we went from the track changes version to this version, we lost some words. But section 15.3 right now, if you read it, says that submissions by councillors and the public for inclusion on the council agenda must be provided to the corporate officer by 4:30 p.m. on the Monday prior to the meeting, which would be 2 days before the council meeting. And that wasn't the intent. And in keeping with other sections of the bylaw, particularly procedures around when delegations under section 18.1 talks about when delegations must have their items to us, which is 9 days before the agenda, which actually before the date of the meeting, which actually reflects current practice and the timelines required to have an item included on the agenda. So in short, staff is requesting that council consider amending section 15 bracket 3 by deleting the words after corporate officer, by deleting by 4:30 p.m. on the Monday, and replacing it with be provided to the corporate officer 9 days prior to the meeting. So the
9
words
calendar
9
days?
Pardon me?
9 calendar days, so it's
We
exactly
could.
the same as 18.1.
Thank you. Yes, we could. That would be great.
9 and then 9 in brackets is a number, then calendar days before or prior. So one would say prior and the other one would say before, but at least that means the same thing, but 9 calendar days. I think it should be consistent. And if other councillors agree, I would actually look then for a motion to rescind third reading. Councillor Seegers, thank you, and Councillor Lutz. And we will be rescinding third reading so we can make that amendment and then adopt third reading to make sure it's all correct. All those in favor of rescinding third reading? Any opposed? That's carried. And then I'd like to have somebody move the motion to amend item 15, clause 15, subclause 3, to strike out the words by 4:30 p.m. on the Monday and replace it with 9 calendar days. Councillor Lutz and Councillor Seegers, I saw. Any discussion? People understand the issue? I think if it's not consistent, we're going to have people bringing them in 2 days before the meeting, and the agendas are sent out 5 days, and nobody's going to read them. So, all those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Unfortunately, that means we don't do the adoption tonight, and it will come back to our next council meeting for adoption. Is there any further discussion of the council procedure bylaw? Councillor Wright.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. On 18.1, it says that the application is reviewed by the presiding member.
Yes.
Which is either the mayor or the chair of the committee. And if you go further down to 18.6, it says that the corporate officer may refuse to place a delegation on the agenda. And then there are some qualifications there. And is it just reviewed by the presiding member? Or is it determined by the presiding member that it will or will not go forward?
If in fact the issues, we'll look at 6 first. If in fact people want to bring things forward that have nothing to do with District Sea Shelter Council, then there's delegated authority for the corporate office to say, this is about a town of Gibson's jurisdiction or something, whatever, totally out of. Similarly, if it's something we have been considered, so there is some delegated authority just on those very 2 specific items. Otherwise, it comes back and it's part of the agenda setting for the normal agenda where the chair would actually officially they make that decision. Actually, staff packages it, gets it all together, and you say, yeah, that'll work. But the chair makes that decision. We do have some policies in terms of only having 2 delegations and things of that nature.
Okay, thank you.
Is that a clear? Yes. Glad I got that right after 3.5 years. Any other discussion? This is a very important document. It's something, it'll be virtually the first thing that a new council looks at in November. And as you can tell, it's also among the last things that councils look at because it does determine the entire process and procedures and how we conduct our business. And it's important to get to know and make sure it works. Then if there's no further questions, we'll move on from that and we'll bring it back for adoption at the next meeting. And we'll move. Oh, yes, we didn't do third reading, did we? We did the amendment?
Actually, yes, you did. Moved and seconded, third as amended.
And that, okay. I thought I did actually, but I couldn't, it goes by so quickly. 10 business items. Now, I would like to interrupt these proceedings because I should have asked for an amendment, and if council is in agreement, we'd like to move 10.4 to follow 10.1 and the temporary use permits. Is there any opposition to that? That's a timing issue for staff, just to allow people to process that, because the 2 items before that are going to be quite long. So we move, if I can find the right agenda item, to 10.1, Should I call for a vote for that amendment? I asked if there was any objections, and there were none. Be good to have a vote as well. If there's no objections, if I see no objections, we'll just make that change. 10.1 is the 2018 second quarter financial report from the Sunshine Coast Community Forest. I have a motion to receive that. Thank you, Councillor Mueller and Councillor Seegers. We don't have the chair to discuss that with us today. It has been practiced in the last year to have the chair bring this forward, but with the new chair, they're still adopting some of these practices. Any comments by staff on that report? Or sorry, by council on that report? We had a very good year last year, and it looks like we'll be in good shape. And hearing the two requests we've already heard for community forest funding, that's good. If there's no discussion, I'll move on then to 10.4, which we've brought forward, which is temporary use permits. First, a motion to receive the report from staff. Councillors, I'm sorry, I'm watching too many things going on here. Councillor Lutz, and seconded by Councillor Seegers. Thank you. And we'll turn then to staff for the report. Who's handing those out?
It's on behalf of myself. These are the letters of comments that we received. Council did receive the emails, but this is a reminder that these is the input that we received on the temporary use permits through the public notification process. So it's just a copy, a reminder of what the information we received. And the two emails apply to all 4 applications. So Mayor and Council, I'd like to give a brief presentation. I'm going to begin with temporary use permits number applications 2018-1, 2018-2, and 2018-3. And first I'm going to talk about a bit about the guidelines for consideration of the temporary use permits. The OCP talks about in policy number 7.37 that council should consider them where, and what I've done is pulled out the ones that are relevant, where the property is zoned for commercial or industrial use or is designated in the OCP as business and industry, downtown, or neighborhood center or resource use. D, that the public has had the opportunity to comment on the proposed use as outlined in the Local Government Act, which requires notification through a newspaper. That has been completed. E is the temporary use permit does not negatively affect existing businesses or surrounding properties in terms of noise, lighting, parking, traffic, or other impacts. And F, special permit conditions including time and use limitations, site restoration, and security provisions can be required or will be required as appropriate. So in terms of the locations of the temporary use permit applications 1 through 3, you can see here on the map the locations of the various ones, and I'm just seeing, is there even a pointer? Oh, maybe there is a pointer here. Oh, there is. So we have the one here from Robin Keller. That's just the location of the weeds. We have We Medical here, which is Kier McPherson, and we have the Sarah
420.
420 Hem Shop, yes.
Don't know why I knew that.
So the zoning bylaw 25, we recently adopted an amendment and we put in the new definition for non-medical marijuana retail. And it means the use of land, buildings, or structures licensed under the provincial regulations for the retail sale of cannabis products. Council also passed a motion in July that we should approach the existing retailers and talk to them about the opportunity to apply to a temporary use permit, since that definition was not included in any zone. This would allow the existing businesses to stay open until such time as they can get their provincial license applications in and look to conform and get their licenses if they can follow that route. At the time, the license portal with the province wasn't open, but it has recently opened, so that they are available. They can try to make that application. The province has also let me know that it would take could take as much as 6 months to get an application reviewed, at a cost of $7,500 per application, just for the. So the first building, it's as we medical is in the ground floor of this 5674 Torito at the corner of Inlet Avenue. We also have number 2 is the Weeds property, is at 5536 Wharf Avenue. And it's important to remember that the temporary use permit will run with the land. It will not follow the business. If the business relocates, the temporary use permit is no longer valid. A temporary use permit is similar to a zoning bylaw, but it's allowing only a temporary use on that particular parcel. So the one we have here, 2018-03, is for 5536 Cowrie, which is Sarah Meyer at 420 Hempshop. The public comments received through the public notification, I've distributed them to you, and you also received them. We have an August 26, 2018 email from Ms. Jerry Patterson, as well as September 3rd email from Ms. Jerry Patterson, and in both cases they were against all of the applications. In summary, our staff recommendations for temporary use permit, you have them before you. In essence, all 3 of these first applications are dealt with in the same manner. What changes is the address and the property identifier. We are looking at the conditions being the use be located on the ground floor of the existing building, that the retail opening hours be limited to 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 7 days a week, and that HEPA filter odor abatement of exhaust air is in operation. And you'll see that again on 2018-2, the exact same conditions, as well as 2018-3. And before we move on, council could consider these, or I could go into the next application. It would be council's wish.
Thank you for that option. I think we should pause and look at recommendations 2, 3, and 4 on your report, page 425, 426, and see if there's any discussion or issues on this particular one. And I'll just remind, the public may not know, but it's been a long story here with non-medical marijuana in the district of Sechelt. They're all operating without business licenses. We're not going to issue business licenses to illegal operations. On the other hand, the RCMP categorically failed and would not close them down. So we've had that long-going interaction with the RCMP on what their role was in enforcing the role and what ours were. Now, as we're moving towards legalization, the legal advice is that even if they've been operating outside of our permit system, that putting a temporary use permit on them is a very important step in safeguarding our interests in the location and other future bylaws that may come into place. So the legal advice is to grant them temporary use permits even though they're not permitted and even though they're illegal operations under the federal law, in order to safeguard the District of Sechelt's interests. It's a bit complicated, but we're trying to follow this through in a way which is fair to the District of Sechelt community interests and to the businesses that are operating. So, Councillor Seegers, I saw you first.
Thank you. In your conclusion, you say allowing temporary use permits for the retail sale of non-medical marijuana will allow the existing business to remain open and allow time for the community to be consulted for further zoning bylaw amendments with regards to non-medical marijuana land uses. So currently, our zoning does not allow them to be in operation where they are. So there's 2 pieces that we're looking at moving forward here. One is zoning that we need to take out to the community, but the other is around them getting licensed. So if they do not get licensing, it doesn't say anything in here about them not having to stop operating at that point. How do we deal with that piece?
I could answer that.
Okay.
We're expecting under the new provincial regimes that the provincial government will take very significant steps in stopping any illegal operations that aren't licensed by the province in the same way they do with liquor and alcohol sales. So that was the expectation and the hope. Now, whether the province enforces cannabis laws as strongly as they enforce liquor laws will be a question for us to wait. Is that correct?
Yes, and I believe that as long as someone has an application before them, they will not be shut down, but the minute that they are refused, or if this council does not endorse them, that the province will take steps to close them.
And that was a good point, and I'm sure Councillor Seegers is aware too that council does have a role in municipalities in the application process and the endorsement, which is another reason to get this out in front of the community in terms of the zoning, so we can actually hear from the community when these applications come forward.
I have a slide at the end of my presentation that describes the next steps.
Okay, so we're looking at the 3 temporary use permits for the 3 locations that are in the downtown core and that are operating at the moment with non-medical marijuana in the traditional sense. Lots of buds in small vials. Any further questions or clarifications? And if not, Councillor Wright? I couldn't tell if your hand was going up to strike down or to look, okay? Could I look for somebody to move recommendations 2, 3, and 4, which is the temporary use permits? Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Councillor Inkster. Any further discussion? All councillors in favor? And any councillors opposed? Is that opposed? No. Okay. Yeah. 1 opposed. That's carried. And now, if you don't mind, we can move on to the one we kept separate because it's in a different zoning.
Could you
area.
pull up my presentation for me? Thank you. I can get there. So, temporary use permit number 4 is slightly different. It's located outside of the downtown core in Sechelt Inlet, the East Porpoise Bay, on Sechelt Inlet Crescent. You can see here the I-6 zone is the purple and the star is the location, yellow star. It's located within Unit 3, 5534 Sechelt Inlet Crescent. And it's a small portion of that building, roughly 90 square meters. And you can see the location here. Again, it's a very small corner of the overall building. The remainder of the property is the Deluxe Landscaping Garden Center. So in this application, they're applying, the application is for production as well as retail. We brought in the rules around non-medical marijuana production. We described it as well as saying where it could go in the last zoning bylaw amendment. And we looked at it as in an I-6 zone, but under certain conditions, such as the lot is 4,000 square meters or more, and they do meet that one. They also meet the next requirement that no school is located within 1,000 meters. But the next requirement is no developed park is located within 500 meters of the lot. That one, there is a waterfront walkway with a small gazebo in front of the Edgewater development, and that was within 500 meters. No neighboring property that is zoned several of their residential zones as well as some commercial zones or any predominantly comprehensive development zone within 100 meters, and it does not meet that. It has the Edgewater townhomes are zoned to the west. No building or structure located within 5 meters or of any rear or side lot lines. It does meet that. No fencing is located within 2 meters of any lot line. Yes, it meets that. Buildings and structures shall not cover more than 50% of the lot area. Yes, that is met on this property. No building height exceeds 2 stories or 10.5 meters. It does meet that. The last one is, except for driveways, the perimeter is continuously landscaped with a buffer of non-invasive trees and shrubs to a height of 1.5 meters or more. does have perimeter landscaping, obviously from Deluxe Landscaping, but it does not have the height requirement in terms of the 1.5 meters. In terms of non-medical marijuana production and non-medical marijuana research are the only uses on the property, and it does not meet those, given that there is Deluxe Landscaping on the same property. However, given that that's the reason they need a temporary use permit for the production part of it, and staff are recommending that the issuance of the temporary use permit be for both production and retail of non-medical marijuana for a period of up to 2 years, and that the requirements, conditions be uses located on the ground floor of the existing building with a maximum floor area of 100 square meters, roughly 1,000 square feet, that the retail opening hours be limited again from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 7 days a week, and that HEPA filter odor abatement of exhaust air is in operation. I would like to add that the applicant, Derek Churchill, did have a public information meeting on Monday evening. A few people attended, but he has told me that they were all positive in terms of their response to it, and most were East Porpoise Bay residents that attended.
Have we heard anything from East Porpoise Bay residents or any from the Edgewater development?
We didn't hear specifically from the strata. We did, part of our the notification does not include mail-outs or delivery. The Local Government Act says just newspaper notification, so that's what we did. The East Porpoise Bay Community Association, though, did not say that they had any disagreement with it or opposition per se.
Thank you. Council considerations. First, if there's any clarifications from staff, and then we should discuss this among ourselves. That's clear, obviously, a good report. And then I would look for some direction from staff, from council, in terms of recommendation number 5. Councillor Mueller.
I'll move recommendation number 5.
And seconded? Seconded by Councillor Lutz. Any discussion? Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So currently our zoning does not allow this operation to happen where it is. It's happening, but it's not legal under our current zoning. So if they go forward and get licensing and that gets approved, they would, unless we change our zoning, they would need to move their facility to some other location. Is that correct?
Correct. They would have to find a property that would meet the regulations of where we have said that medical and non-medical marijuana can be produced.
Okay. If that's the case, I can support this at this point. Thank you.
Any further discussion, Councillor Mueller?
Yeah, I know that this one is slightly different than the others. Of course, when we're dealing with such a large regulatory change as the legalization of marijuana is, there are going to be some that do not conform. And that's why I like the approach that staff have taken of going with the temporary use permits, because it gives us the leeway in our system to kind of deal with what's coming down from higher governments. And they are absolutely in the driver's seat when it comes to marijuana legalization, and I'll be taking my cues from them. And at this point, we still have the structure to deal with this at a later date if the zoning and land use becomes an issue in the District of Sechelt.
Any further discussion? Councillor Lutz?
And because we are giving them a temporary one up to 2 years, doesn't mean it would be there for 2 years. We could withdraw it earlier.
That's correct. Council has the discretion to withdraw a temporary use permit if for whatever reason the license fails or we bring in a zoning bylaw that allows it at that location. So it's up to council's discretion. Could you bring up the next slides? I just have a quick, I wanted to just quickly talk about what's new in BC is that I spoke about that. The retail application fee is $7,500. If approved the first year and every year thereafter, it's $1,500. The Liquor Control and Licensing Branch has been renamed to Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch. The local government guidelines for review of license applications are out, and accessory sales by licensed retailers. We did have a question about that, and I found the information. The federal government defines what an accessory is, and that's in terms of things like bongs, filter papers, and they have to be done at the point of sale. So similar to the liquor store, if you go in there and buy a bottle of wine, you can buy a bottle opener or a gift bag, but you can't just go in there and shop for non-alcohol products. And they have come out too with a another definition that deeming what is a cannabis accessory is everything that's sold at the same point of sale as cannabis. So you will not be able to buy a t-shirt without buying cannabis, or filter papers without buying cannabis. So in that sense, all of our applicants will have to separate in terms of, even if they're in the same space on the same property, they are going to have to become a separate store, divided away, such as like at 420 Hemp, they're not going to be able to sell clothing, those kinds of things. So they are going to, each and every one of them will have to sort of divide up their businesses or decide in which way they want to do that. In terms of what next steps for Sechelt are, Council has already asked us to draft bylaw amendments to the smoking bylaw, to the business license bylaw, to the fees and charges bylaws. We're also looking to draft a policy on how Council may wish to consider reviewing retail and production marijuana licenses applications, both for non-medical and medical marijuana. And we're also going to be drafting the community consultation engagement plan for a further zoning amendment to look at what does the community want. Is 4 enough? Do we want them in different locations? How do we want to look at that? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And we've had some discussion of recommendation number 5. Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, I think it's, I'm glad that a number of council members have talked about the reason for the temporary use and the fact that the federal government, as we all know, and the legislation date has changed. It was supposed to come earlier this year, is coming now, and that's why we're looking at bringing in this legislation locally. And we see, and if many of us have traveled, we see the locations of these stores in other communities. So it's not necessarily Sechelt being on the bleeding edge of the issue. When we look at the fees coming out, though, that have been presented by staff, it's interesting. They're very similar to liquor licensing fees, except the original amount, which I'm imagining is what could be argued as a fee from the province to take a look at the locations and see what's going on, and there would be a charge for the province doing that kind of research and analysis of each location, I'm assuming, because otherwise it's quite a large initial fee that they're collecting. I'm assuming that's the kind of due diligence that that fee is creating. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion on recommendation number 5? I would say that I had some reservations about this particular one, in part because of the fact that it's so at odds with our zoning bylaw, and secondly because it's a different kind of use with the production, and I wanted to be sure that we had an equitable approach to production and that we didn't somehow make, I mean, it looks like a benign little store on the side, and it probably is, but then using the same criteria might open things up in other places for other kinds of production. I reminded myself, however, that the zoning bylaw, and the reason they're out of conformity with it in terms of park space and residential is because in 2015, this council introduced a very draconian bylaw, a zoning bylaw, specifically to slow down a fairly fast process when it was out of hand and we didn't know what was going on. So 3 years later, things seem to be far more measured, and we can look at these in a systematic way and actually have had community input compared to what we felt was going on in 2015. So they are out of conformity, but that's in partly because we had such a strong and sweeping bylaw that we put in place in 2015. So just remind council of that period compared to the more measured situation that's here now when there is a provincial and federal regulations coming into play. We'll look then, it's been moved and seconded. If there's no further discussion, I'll look for all those in favor of recommendation 5. And are there any opposed? 1 opposed, and that's carried. And thank you very much for your patience through that. And we're moving now finally to item 10.2, which is the West Porpoise Bay Estates, and Councillor Lutz will excuse herself. because she lives within a proximity of the area, no direct financial interest, but she's within the catchment area for notice. And I will look as she leaves for somebody to move recommendation that the report be received. Councillor Mueller, Councillor Wright, all those in favor? Are any opposed to the report being received? I guess not, they're just abstaining. Director Corbett, please.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. What is in front of you is an application for reconsideration of development variance permit, which you dealt with previously, and also to go through the various development permit requirements. And I'll go through in a little more detail why that is and what's being looked at.
And can I just check how the
Yes.
volume is at the back? Can you hear the director when she's speaking?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So this proposal is for, as you know, for a multi-unit residential development. It's 6 buildings, 80 units. There's 2 different types of buildings here. 2 of them are 4 stories of residential, 16 units each. That's buildings 5 and 6 that have parking at grade. And then the others are, there are 4 of them that are 3 stories of residential with parking, a level of parking. Those have 12 units each. The current zoning on this site is R4, which is similar to a number of the surrounding areas. So in the application chronology, on March 21st is when you dealt with the original variance request for height, and it was denied. And the development permit at that time was deferred, so we didn't go into much discussion around the development permit guidelines. On August 1st, they introduced the request for reconsideration of the variance and the development permit. That was deferred. There weren't that many people at council at that time. I also felt for the purpose of this presentation to not only deal with the variance, but a lot more on the development permit. So the considerations in front of you are in terms of kind of council authority and what you and weigh in on it here. The application needs to be consistent with the R4 zoning, particularly the use, the height, and the density. There had been a lot of correspondence and a lot of communication around the whole Form P issue. It is written into the Form P itself that it needs to be consistent with the R4 and with any of the district bylaws. The Form P does not override that. Then there is the consideration of the height variance. Council has complete discretion as to whether to approve, modify, or deny that. And then the other that council needs to weigh in on is the alignment with the applicable development permit area guidelines. This particular application, there are 4 development permit areas that apply to this site. The foreshore and shoreline protection development permit areas, number 3 and number 4. The steep slopes development permit area number 5, and the form and character considerations DPA number 7. I do have in the staff report the very detailed guidelines and indication as to whether they have been met, whether they're applicable, or whether they have not been met. So this property has been zoned since 1983. A more relatively recent Form P up to 2008. This was the Grimwald development, and you have information from that applicant. There were 47 units in this area. The particular design was a step design down the slope. And then in 2017, there was a new Form P that was signed. This strata was severed from the existing strata. The development is 2 stories at the Strata Road site and 4 stories essentially from the base. It is podium on stilt development. So in terms of the variance request, when it was turned down, the applicants did have an application that looked at a development that didn't require the height variance. We had some concerns internally around that from staff while we can perhaps meet the height issue, there are still issues associated with that with the development permit, so that's something that I'll need some guidance on as to if there was a decision not to grant the variance, again, as to what type of application, what type of things do they need to meet the actual DP guidelines as well. One of the things that was noted on this application is that the height of the development and the amount of development at the Strata Road does not change. This still came through as a two-story development, or two-story at the Strata Road. So with regard to the issues around views associated with the existing strata, this wouldn't have addressed it. It does, one of our concerns was it does bring in a lot more infrastructure. There's now 2 roads. So some pros and cons on that. There's more development, there's more site alteration involved in this. It obviously changes the access and provides an additional access onto Marine Way, which could be a benefit. But it certainly had a different approach to it. It would require an amendment to the Form P in addition to the development permits. So that's what kind of triggered, does the variance need to be reconsidered? Is this a better solution? Or as I go through the development permit area guidelines, does council have more direction for the applicant in terms of what makes for an acceptable development? So this was the height variance. This is the information that went out on our notification as to what was increasing. You'd notice from the previous variance, some of them went down, some of them went up. Part of that, particularly on buildings 5 and 6, and particularly building 5, that building was shifted, and so the stilts length on one of the sides resulted in an increase in that height. On some of the other ones, it was the same kind of issue. The amount of development, the type of development wasn't changing. In some areas, because the site not only slopes down, it does this across the slope. It means that how you measure at the base can differ by building, and it can kind of sway what the actual height is. In terms of the appearance from the Strata Road, that doesn't alter in this. They did try and took some steps to reduce the ceiling heights on the actual residential units, and they altered the type of elevator that went in to reduce the height of the elevator shaft that would be visible. So there were some modest changes made to reduce the appearance of the height at the road. As mentioned in R4, the height allowance is 10.5 meters. That essentially allows a 3-story building. One of the reasons this gets a little more complicated on slope is the way we measure height, particularly for multi-buildings, is we take the measurements at the 4 corners of the height, for that's the average grade, and then it's to the midpoint on that roof line. So when you have a very steep slope, it alters what that average grade is. So it can make it challenging to meet a 10.5 on a slope site at the 2 ends off the slope. So this is what the type of development, this is building number 5, where it has the parking coming in more at grade. It does have 4 levels of residential. This would be more than a 10.5, even if it was on grade. As mentioned, a 10.5 is basically a 3-story. We will often see in a lot of our developments that come in at R4, it's 3 stories of residential. The parking is buried. On this particular development, on 2 of the buildings, the parking, on 5 and 6, the parking is at grade coming in there, but it's 4 full floors of residential. And on the other buildings, I'll go through that, how they manage their parking. So these are the type of buildings that you'll see on buildings 7, 8, 9, and 10. They have a very similar kind of structure. They are on podium, and then the parking is within or underneath the 3 stories of residential. It's podium on stilt, and the parking runs through the entire site underneath that building. I'll go through a few other photos that show just how you access that parking onto that site. And this shows just some different views of it. So in some of the buildings, particularly 9 and 10, they're a little bit more into the slope. The parking area is a little more buried in those ones. On 7 and 8, it is essentially up on the stilts. But that gives you a sense of just the type of building, the type of massing, and what they are trying to do on these. So their overall concept in this is to do, compared to the previous Form P, the previous kind of development, they're larger buildings, but there's fewer of them. So it was a way of, in the applicant's sense, of just to do a little less site alteration to get that kind of density. So this would be the type of development from the Strata Road. You can see that it's still a 2-story from that area and quite a tight interface at the road. This is taken on the far side. That's taken from essentially the access that would come into, something needs to be plugged in there. The access road that comes into Marine Way, into the access, and this is essentially where you would access into the parking into buildings 5 and 6. On the far side, it just gives a sense of this is the kind of interface from the existing strata. So I'll go through, come back to the variance permit, but I'll go through a lot of the development permit guidelines. As I mentioned, the detail of this is in the report because there are numerous guidelines on that. But essentially what we're looking at here and what applies to this kind of site is both environmental development permits, the steep slope, and then the form and character. So on DPA number 3, this is the intent of this, it's protecting the foreshore from the impacts of development. A key requirement there is having that 15-meter setback so that you're not impacting wave action, you're not impacting the environmental aspect of the shoreline. In this development, they certainly meet that. There's no intention of going into the foreshore. There is a 15-meter setback there. None of the vegetation in that area has been altered, so that remains as a forested, vegetated area. So in terms of the guidelines that applied on this one, the applicant did meet all of these. And the same kind of approach was taken with DPA number 4. Again, it's looking at protecting the shorelines. This one goes into a little bit more on the shoreline wave erosion. It tries to protect it from a lot of the alterations that can happen on the shorelines when developments are doing either very aggressive retaining walls, docks, anything that really gets into the shoreline. This development did meet those particular aspects. They're not proposing to do any alterations into that area. There are no docks planned for this. There's quite a steep interface into the shoreline area, so it's not really conducive to easy access into there. And so they had met those particular guidelines both through their development plans and through the 15-meter setback area. On the DPA steep slope, so in this particular development permit area, it tries to do two things. One is protecting the slopes from excessive alteration from an environmental point of view, but it's also looking at protecting development itself and ensuring that it can be integrated into there and it's not creating any geotechnical hazards to the development itself. In this area, it applies to any development area that exceeds 30%. This is the majority of this particular area. Most of it is between 30 and 60% slope. Under one of the guidelines with respect to steep slopes, it says that development may be considered where it can be demonstrated that the proposed development will not create environmental or visual impacts. It can be sensitively integrated with the terrain, and it presents no hazards to persons or property. In any kind of development on steep slopes, there's always the requirement for geotechnical reviews. Where they are more complex, we do peer review on the geotechnicals. And for all of developments like this, we do get the landslide assessment. The landslide assessment has been done and was cleared for this development. There were several geotechnical reports available for this site, and the most recent one done was for this particular development proposal. It was done in 2017. It does include quite a bit of direction on the development, everything from the constructability as well as guidelines around when the geotechnical engineer needs to be on site as they develop. These are some site photos of the property. You can see where the existing development is, where that subsequent phase was started, where there's that large concrete area. That's where a lot of the parking area for number 5 and 6 are going to come into the site. You can see how much of the site has already been cleared in this area. The other on that gets a bit interesting with DPA number 5 is when we're looking at very steep slopes, the intention on there is that we actually don't apply density onto slopes that are between or exceeding the areas of 30%. On this one, that's pretty much all of the site. And as mentioned, this was previously zoned in the 80s. If we were looking at this in this particular time frame, it wouldn't carry this kind of density. The building site, the guidelines also state the building site should fit with the natural slope contours such that the structural retaining walls and extensive cut and fills are not required. There certainly would be requirements on this site just given the nature of it. The question is, what is the best approach to it to reduce the extent of site alteration in this area? It also guides that large monolithic housing forms that are visually prominent on hillsides are not supported. This is some photos taken from the site. This is actually at the far end of the site. This is where buildings 5 and 6 would be, or in that general area. I'm on that side of the slope, just above the 15-meter setback there. You can see where the trees are. That's the line. It gives you an indication of how steep this is. That's in similar area. I've just kind of walked over a little bit more and a little higher onto the slope. What's that? Yes. Now, in DPA number 7, this is for form and character. DPA 7 applies to a number of our areas, but particularly multi-unit residential. The kind of things that get looked at in there are a number of components, and the report itself has a little more detail on this in terms of site planning, form and character, the materials, relationship to adjacent uses, the accessibility, sustainability and lighting, privacy and open spaces, safety and security. Some of the elements of this were addressed in the original proposal. It did have the sustainability checklist attached to it, so I won't go through too much in there that was already part of the package. This is essentially just the site plan that gives you a notion of where the development is. As mentioned with this, a desire in changing from the other Form P, one was to enhance the density on the site, but also to reduce the number of buildings and the amount of cut and fill required to accommodate that. This is the landscape plan. It doesn't include the park area below. This is just at the front end of the site. As you can see in the photos, a lot of it is pure rock. So there's, as you get downslope, there's minimal opportunity for landscaping in those areas. And then the natural vegetation at that 15-meter setback. This is an old photo. It was actually taken from the geotechnical report. I didn't have one actually from that angle. It just gives a sense of the scale of the existing development. It was taken before the site was cleared. This is just across the road from Marine Way Drive. This is more recent. This was this morning. This is the existing development. Gives you a sense of the scale and the type of development on the other side of the Strata Road. This is where building number 10 will be, so this is what is across from it. You can also see across Marine Way that there are other buildings that are under that R4 zoning that are on quite steep slopes. Those are 3 stories with underground parking, and as you get around Marine Way, just across that, very large retaining walls on that particular development. This is the type of development from the Strata Road. It's obviously a different development from the existing. The other is more of a cottage-style wood development. This picks up a lot of the colors, but is a different, obviously more modern development. In terms of scale, it matches it. Another photo from the Strata Road area. This is the configuration of the building that would be visible from the inlet side of the development, looking up. So it does utilize a number of different materials, both natural materials in terms of wood and stone. Thought I'd include some for the parking area, because the parking area is a little confusing to figure out on just the basic site plan. So these are how for buildings 5 and 6, when it shows it at grade, it's not a 2-story parkade. I know there were some questions around that. It is a 1-story out there, but there's access into the lower levels, into those other buildings, comes down that roadway. So that's not actually parking, it's actually the access into those other buildings. This shows another configuration. So you're coming in off the Strata Road in either location, coming down into the parking, either into the parking structure or going below that, and that's then bringing you around and accessing into this building 7, 8, 9, and 10. The roof lines on all of the buildings at this level all have green roofs on them. So this is what it looks like from grade. And then I'll go back to that. So the issue for council is whether to consider the variance, how much of the variance, and also to provide some guidance on the development permit itself of if there's any concerns with that, and if there are, what guidelines you feel have been met, have not been met, and to provide some clear guidance to both staff and to the applicant on how to move forward. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much for that. It was you've dealt with this in quite a bit over the last while, but very clear, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate the technical expertise that walks us through this, and especially through the development permit areas. This was before us in August. We only had 4 council members. It was a quorum, but it wasn't with one councillor excused for potential conflict of interest. There was only 4 members, and I thought it was a significant enough issue that we should have a full council to make sure it in fact did reflect the direction of council and the community on this decision. And as mentioned, we have looked at the height variance once already and said no, it came back, and there's another request. And there's also the concern about the development permit areas, which I'll speak to later if others don't. But first I'll just look to council, and we have a number of recommendations. They're all framed in the positive. That doesn't mean anything more than that's the way it's presented. Councillor Mueller, as chair of the planning committee, I guess you've been looking at this for some time.
Yes, we have, but I just wanted to start with a question on the report, and it's a process one. This council denied the variance permit for height, and now we see one where the heights are not changed, but it's been entertained for a reconsideration. I'm just curious why that is.
So as mentioned in the presentation, one of the reasons that we were reconsidering the height, can you bring the PowerPoint back up? Thank you. Was that when they brought in a proposal for the development without the height variance, in looking at it, we felt that it actually would have been more problematic from a site perspective and meeting the development permit area guidelines. So it looked so it solved one problem, created some other ones. So I wanted to have it back in front of council to consider the height variance in conjunction with the development permit to get a sense of not only the height issue, but also the other guidelines, because solving one may still leave some of those issues open. So it just needed a little more thought of, does it make more sense to have the original proposal of the fewer buildings but higher? Does it make more sense, although there'd be more site alteration, to do the numerous buildings lower height? That was the issue on it.
Is that helpful? It speaks to how complex this site is, the fact that an alternative could be worse than the first. On the other hand, it also speaks to the importance of council making a decision about OCP guidelines and development permit guidelines.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I raised that was in terms of the reconsideration, it wasn't triggered in the way that a mayor would bring back a reconsideration. No. It was triggered in the fact that staff thought something had altered. And so I just wanted to get a real handle on what they thought was different.
Through the chair, that's correct. The reconsideration, if the mayor brought in, I think there was a time limit on that as well. I think it's 30 days. We didn't actually see the new proposal till very close to that time, so it wouldn't have had time to come back to council for that kind of reconsideration. It was more when we started to look into it and really felt that it was a quandary in that it solved one problem, but I believe it created some other ones, so it needed more guidance on the development permit area aspect.
So even though the height variance is back in front of us, in a sense, it's like a different development than we looked at first. So they brought back a different configuration, they did make some changes, but at the end of the day, we still have to deal with height.
Correct.
And others. That's why it's back. Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, I think there's been a number of questions asked, particularly by one council member that sort of alludes to the fact that their height variances requested are quite substantive. And that's one issue, quite a large issue, because as presented there's a number of buildings, 4 of them, that have quite a substantive request and change to the original height allowable of 10.5. So that's a big issue for me with a number of the buildings. I would also mention too that I have some geotech issues with the building. with one of the buildings in particular, and I think that we should be mindful of that as a council, because geotech is important to some members of our community, that we make sure that that's done right. And I've heard that from some community members, so we need to do that. The other issue that I wanted to point out is the original units, and thanks to the planning staff for doing some historical analysis and research to find that the original units were quite a bit less than this proposal that was proposed then. So based on the neighborhood and the citizens that are in that neighborhood, the original amount was less units with most likely less height, and not the geotech question. So I'm very uncomfortable as it stands with the proposal before us. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's probably a point to note that we do have a package of public comments that came in over the last couple of days, some of them as early as today. If you listen to our council procedure bylaw a little earlier, we like things to come in about 9 days before a meeting so they can be put into an agenda so we can actually know we read them. So when we do receive late comments, they're in front of council, but you shouldn't consider that they've actually been considered and thought through. They've probably glanced at and aware of. So, but they are in front of council, and they were put together in a package that we received. And I think council has a strong sense of what the tone and decisions of those are, but they may not have reflected on them the way they would have if they had it in advance. So back to the recommendations. We do have to get something on the floor to determine which direction we should go. So I'd look first for discussion of recommendation number 2, which is the one that actually deals with the building height variance. Is there anyone who would move recommendation 2? Oh, question? Sure. Yeah, I don't mind more discussion. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. In your report, on page, hang on, I have to find it here. Page 92. See, the development is still subject to DPA guidelines, yes. Under zoning considerations, proposed density for the site area is 80 units, which equates to 45.4, so it's less than the OCP apartment-based density of 50, so it does not include any density bonusing. And yet, during your presentation, you said if it was steep slopes, it would not allow this density. So how do we reconcile the two?
Oh, interesting.
Through the chair. So the OCP contains information around base densities. And so with regard to this application, it wouldn't require an OCP amendment to support this density. It's well below that. Under an R4 area, it provides, under the zoning, it provides a density, assuming all things are equal and it's essentially a fully developable site. That's what your maximum density is. Where it gets more complex on a very steep slope, and what the intent of the development permit area is to say that when you're on very steep area, you don't actually apply the density to that. You'd actually net that out. So even though it could be zoned R4, if you had sections of the development area, so this is something we go through in our subdivision process, if you had areas that were, say, 50% slope, we would net those out. It wouldn't be part of the developable area. So where this site gets very complex is it was previously zoned before we had development permit area guidelines, before there were kind of those restrictions on very steep slopes. So it applied an R4 zoning to an area that, if we were looking at that now as just a greenfield site, you wouldn't apply that amount of density to it. So that's the complexity. So it's below the OCP amount, no amendment required. They're not asking for bonusing. Under the R4, if that was a flat site, that would be what your maximum under the zone is. But it's a steep slope, and the development permit area guidelines provide that guideline that restricts certain development.
You used the phrase the density wouldn't apply. It would be fair to say the density wouldn't be allowed? under current conditions?
Correct. What we would do
Because it's just the
under-
choice of the word apply, and it sounds like we're applying for density. But you wouldn't allow that to be applied to the project, meaning it wouldn't be allowed.
What you do is you'd net out your developable and non-developable area. So the amount of area that you'd apply the zoning to would be reduced. So it wouldn't necessarily sterilize the whole area. It just reduces your developable.
Councillor Seegers?
Yeah, follow-up then. If we're looking at a site that has 30 and greater slopes, under our current guidelines, all of this land would be undevelopable. Is that correct? Thank you.
For those that didn't hear the answer, it was yes. It was quiet. However, that's current, and this was zoned in 1983. I can't remember it happening, but I don't think Mike was there either. It was just before Earl Bassey. It might have been Nancy McClarty. Council. Interesting. Anyways, time goes on, and we're dealing tonight, and the first thing I think I'm looking for is whether anyone would move recommendation number 2, which is the recommendation on height variance. And if nobody does, it'll die right here at the table. And then I'll move on to the development permit areas. Anyone to move the recommendation so it's in front of us? That's probably easier than a vote against. So I don't have a motion to put it forward. That means we will not be approving the development variance permit for height under recommendation number 2, which means we go back to our original denial some months ago, and the applicant will have to reconsider what he can propose within the zoning and within the minimal heights. And that also pretty much negates all of the rest of the recommendations as I see them, because he'll have to rethink the project. But I think we should talk about the development permit areas. And I've been fairly quiet as chair of these meetings while this process went through for a couple of reasons, but mostly because I like our committee structure, and I thought the planning committee was managing this in a very interesting and positive way and getting through it. When I've been watching this, and the development permit areas have been the ones that really concern me, and when we go through your lists on pages, starts on a page about 103 and carries through 102, and you actually grade whether or not they meet development permit areas or not, there's a lot of no and a lot of partials and a fair number of yeses. So they do meet a number, I would say about 60%, but there's at least 30% that are partially met or no. And quite frankly, I would like to see a proposal that came through that had mostly yeses and a few partially met, rather than so many that you just flatly say, no, it doesn't meet those guidelines. So if we're going to have guidelines, if we're going to have them in place, I think we should be encouraging developers and architects to work towards as many compliance possibilities as possible, so that the director and the planning staff can go through and tick them off and say yes, 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 or partial, or attempts, and this is why we made a variance. But there's a lot of no's in those pages, especially on the steep slopes and in the next section after that. So that's my feeling. I don't know how other councillors would take that, or how the planning committee has discussed. I don't know if the planning committee has discussed development permits specifically or not. Not directly. Any other comments on this in terms of guidance to the, yes, Councillor Seegers, in terms of helping staff and other council members understand where we're at on this?
I'd like to ask staff, what are you looking to us to give you as guidance? You're looking for heights, what are you looking for?
Through the chair, it would be helpful to have a sense of, from council's perspective, on some of those guidelines where it's been a no or partial, to have some guidance back on that if the applicants are revising a proposal of, are there certain things that you would want to see? Is there certain guidance or information that you'd want transferred to the applicant with regard to this?
Councillor Seegers?
Sounds like what I'm hearing around the council table is we're not going to do any variances, so height allowance will be 10.5 meters. And that means that the density and the massing will probably have to be reduced, which may mean more buildings. Some kind of configuration like that. At least that's what I'm hearing up here.
Councillor Mueller, and then I'll speak to some of the development permit.
Yes, thank you. When dealing with development applications, I try to look across what the different files we've dealt with and try to find some equity and some parity amongst different files, just to make sure that we're dealing with the whole sector more or less fairly. We have had ones that are in some ways similar to this, where the application has come in and it's very, very close to the edge. We have 30 to 60% slopes on this site, and as we know in our current policies, that's not something that we entertain for high density. In that respect, what is here, what I feel may move forward is a drastically reduced scope of development on this site, and that's to be left with the applicant, of course. However, when you come up against these types of things and you're asking for height variances of up to 7.6 meters, that's not something, of course, that I think any council should entertain, because it's just not equitable. The other issues, they're major. We've dealt with steep slopes, sites like this with really difficult access, and in the past they've failed. Okay, so that's something for the applicant to consider as well.
Any other comments? Councillor Shanks.
Yeah, I think the ringing comments in my mind are with respect to, albeit the adjacent properties. I can't understand why somebody would eliminate views, you know, in terms of property across from the lane. And it's actually got nothing to do with what was supposedly promised or was promised, but for me it has everything to do with why would you create a development that did that. And it may be different if the buildings adjacent to that are already built were in fact basements on one level and living area on the top. That would alleviate a concern for me if it was in fact one story on the new construction opposite those homes. But it's rang clear on several occasions to most of the members of the planning committee, and I just can't fathom it out whether to believe those people or not to believe those people when they bought. It just doesn't make sense to me if I didn't even have that information. Thank you.
Okay. I forgot to remind you that we try and limit applause and comments and responses, so let's try and get through the meeting. Councillor Seegers, then I'll put myself on the list for a couple of comments about development permit areas in specific. Councillor Seegers, please.
Okay. If we're asking for the height allowance to be 10.5 meters, do we actually have any say whether it's 1 story or 2 story if it comes back and the height allowance is within the guidelines? I mean, I'm addressing the views piece, right?
No, we know.
I don't believe we do.
No.
So but I'm just looking for clarification around that, because we may be saying we're only going to allow the 10.5, but it might come back to us as a 2-story building opposite the current buildings that are there, which will not alleviate some of the issues that some of the residents that are there currently have, and we will not have anything that we can do about it. So clarification, thank you.
All right, through the chair. With regard to strictly on height, that is correct. They are entitled to 10.5. If they were to do that kind of development in the way they've got it, yes, you could still have a two-story at the Strata Road. The only way that could be altered is if it was through specific DPA guideline that you felt it needed to change the form in that regard. We don't have guidelines that specifically go to views, but we do have guidelines that go to sensitive integration and that sort of thing. So it would have to be specific to that. But in terms of their allowance on the height, that's correct. They could do that.
So on the development permit areas, if I could speak to some of those, when we have so many different sections which actually ask them to be sensitive to natural configurations, the natural landscape, what's already existing, and they're met with no's, if they could be moved to partial, but I would expect some compensation in other areas where, for example, the sustainability could be very high, or the integration with the existing community could be very high. So if there's going to be development permit areas where they can't meet the guidelines, I would expect to see that compensated for in other architectural ways in terms of the natural configuration or the existing neighborhood. So there's some balance that they can work with on that. I'm quite aware that the decision we made tonight on height will mean the architect and developer will have to go back and look at options which would be considerably more expensive in terms of the site, in terms of access, in terms of roads and things of that nature. We also know this developer. We've worked with them well enough over the last 2 to 3 years to know and that they are in fact smart, creative, very business oriented. Yes, they're assertive, and we've had lots of assertive exchanges, but my sense is that when they hear the clear direction of council, they will actually look at the economics and the financing and say, well, yeah, if we went ahead with option one, which it's going to cost X much more money, so we'd rather not do that. Let's find option B, C, or D that finds that happy medium. And I think they're quite able to do that. I don't think they'll just spend excess money to build a bad development despite themselves and everyone else. I think they'll respond creatively the way they have in other instances. So, but when they do that and they come back, I would hope that they meet as many of the development permit guidelines as possible. And when they don't, you'll be able to show us where they've compensated in other areas, in terms of integration, in terms of working with the neighborhood, in terms of sustainability and other guidelines that are there. I think that would make it easier for all of us. And Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to echo what you're saying about the developer that we've seen before. And the assertiveness is true. Council's also seen that before. But we have seen another development that they put forward in a number of different iterations in reaction to community concerns. And I'm sure they can do that in this case, as we had witnessed on the waterfront of Sechelt just last year. Thank you.
Anything further? Does staff have enough? I mean, we didn't vote on all of the different things, but you got different council considerations to put into your mix. Is there anything more we can do to make that clear? And have we dealt with the actual issue? When you have your staff meeting tomorrow morning, will you know what we did with item 10.2?
A little more clarity would be good.
No height variance at the moment. Start with reconfiguring the site and meeting as many development permit area guidelines as possible. If there's going to be variances, they have to show us why that's really helping to fit in all sorts of sustainable ways. Thank you. And thank you for your patience. I know that some people were disappointed when I brought this out of August and into September, but I think it was important to have a full council, and you saw a full council debate and discuss and come to terms with a very complex site. So thank you for your patience tonight. We still have about 17 items if you'd like to stay. We're only on page 173. We have 300 pages to go. Oh, yes, and Alice. Yes, Alice comes back. Thank you, and Councillor Lutz has returned. She said she had time to finish her novel. So, 10.3, Parks and Open Space Master Plan, and this is before us for adoption, but it may also have some more discussion. First, a motion to receive the report from the Director of Planning and Development. Councillor Lutz, Councillor Seegers, all those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried, and we turn to you again for briefer discussion.
Thank you, Your Worship, members of council. What is in front of you is the Parks and Open Space Master Plan for adoption. This was dealt with at the last Committee of the Whole and presentation from Lanark. So the rationale for this project, it was an update to the 2006 Master Plan. It established a vision for Sechelt along with policies and recommendations, and it provides a very comprehensive implementation plan and funding strategy, which was interesting. A lot of consultants stopped short of that. It was interesting to get something so comprehensive on that. It was done through a three-phase project. It involved a number of opportunities for consultation, for input. Council had received a number of updates from the previous planner as we moved through this project. And then the last phase being the discussion of the final at the Committee of the Whole. It was interesting in looking at all the survey results. I think it speaks really highly to what the Parks Department is doing, that most cases people express satisfaction with what they already had. They just wanted more, and maintenance. So it was interesting that it wasn't suggesting there were major gaps in our parks and open space system. There are definitely some minor ones that they want to look at, but by and large, a lot of the feedback was that you're doing a great job, we really like what's there, keep going. So preference for more of the improvements and maintenance of the existing parks over significant expansion. Lots of support for trails extensions, connecting some of the gaps, certainly improving waterfront access and amenities. Most of the popular activities were less programmed kind of parks activities of walking, hiking, dog walking, running. It did provide a vision for Sechelt. I won't read that out because I can't. But I can if I look down on this, that it is, and I think it is certainly true that it really is a defining feature of the district of Sechelt. I think it is a real selling point, both from terms of people moving here to reside, but also from an economic development point of view, that this is certainly a big part of our marketability is the parks and open space and the trails. And now we can combine them with microbreweries, so it will be awesome. The plan itself looked at six different goals, and a lot of the measures were combined underneath these ones. These were the 10 major community-wide projects. There were also recommendations in place for neighborhood-specific and smaller scale, but in terms of the top priorities for the community-wide projects, the number one by quite a margin was the waterfront trail connecting Trail Bay and Davis Bay. Will certainly be one of the most challenging projects to complete. The other was completing the Suncoaster Trail, active transportation connections, more on the BC Hydro right-of-way connector, the conversion of the boulevard to a pedestrian route, not necessarily totally pedestrian, Hackett Park community gathering space, Mission Point Park and Brookman upgrades in that park area, the Chapman Creek Trail right-of-ways that are moving forward, Kinnickinnick Park improvements, and then a community gathering place for the Eastern Inlet area. In terms of, sorry, I missed one. Did go through, as I say, it did provide a financing study. So it looked at a number of options for parks acquisition. It also provided a lot of really good guidance to my department on development, how we take parks acquisition, what kind of criteria we should look at so that we're getting usable and meaningful spaces through our development process. So they looked at a number of parks acquisition options, including user fees, property and parcel taxes, setting up a park reserve fund, the use of our DCCs to extend and improve parks, donations, and then amenity contributions that we would take through the bonusing provisions. In terms of implementing and updating and kind of keeping the plan alive and relevant, there's a number of opportunities as we move forward into implementation for periodic reviews and implementation updates that would come before either committee or council or both. We have annual meetings with the community associations. I think we're moving to a little more frequently. And this is an opportunity to check back on some of the priorities through those meetings. Certainly any of the implementation projects would come through our capital budget and business plan processes. Would probably impose a 5-year plan review or certainly aim for that. It was interesting in looking at the 2006 of how much actually got implemented, and so the 5-year to 8-year time horizon seems to be a good one for completing things and doing another update. And then it's probably useful to do periodic surveys, whether it's resident satisfaction or something more specific to parks, to look at our priorities changing, our demographics changing, do we need to recalibrate anything? So I think there's a lot of opportunities as we move forward to look at that, to keep the plan alive and to keep it quite meaningful and to keep people engaged in it. So in terms of the recommendation, it was that the Parks and Open Space Master Plan be adopted. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And we've had this before us a couple of times now in committee of the whole, I think, and now tonight for adoption. I would just say we did get a couple of letters, again, relatively recently in terms of our agenda setting, which called for us to defer this to make a few more amendments and text amendments. Because it's not a bylaw, and actually not, it's a plan, I don't think we need to delay council's support for this any longer, but I also don't think there's any reason why we couldn't make some of the text amendments that were requested. I wouldn't change any maps. I wouldn't, any of the main planning documents if things are coming out of the OCP. But if there's text amendments where one neighborhood association is quantifiably treated differently than others, then it's easy enough to strike that language and make it standard. So there's and I think we should look at those two letters that came in from what some people call North Sechelt in our last survey. Everything from the village in North Sechelt, West Sechelt, and South Sechelt. So we got 2 letters from North Sechelt, Tilikum Bay and Twanik. And I think we could deal with that even if we adopted and supported the plan as we have it in front of us. Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, I read those comments as well. I think they were fair comments, and I'm sure that we can make those changes to reflect those comments. The plan that's in front of us, I think we should adopt it because some of the things that I'd like to see us do have been delayed by those that would like to see us have a plan in place before we put in financial pieces and or specific plannings to parks. So I am happy, though, that the planner did put forward some regular amendment processes to look at this particular plan, because as we noted, a large portion of our community, the recreational users, organized recreational users, were not present. And I've mentioned that a number of times, and there's a lot of that is made up of youth, but there's parents involved, and I think they unfortunately didn't take the opportunity. I don't know necessarily why. Maybe it's how we gather information. So in future, we may need to improve that to make sure that we represent youth and families more, and those that use, even adults that use our parks more in an organized manner. And we have many of them. As we heard about one group this summer at Hackett and Kinnickinnick. And it's important, as was mentioned, and the planner did mention, the economic development pieces that we have with our parks and the connectivities of our parks that are a reason why people move to Sechelt, and why I think one of the reasons why our population's grown. And to see, since I was first elected to council many years ago, I guess we'll call it now, just when I started, and as the mayor remembers, I started talking about parks, and in a sense from a complaining viewpoint, saying we need to do more. And I think the councils, good on them, have been committed to improving our parks and adding more recreational park equipment for organized sports. And then we started to move towards naturalization and linear trail networks, and then beach accesses, which is one of the things that I said that we should do, have more access to our oceans. So I'm glad we're continuing with that, but I think that we need to continue to work with user groups to make sure that people are represented. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So this plan came at the Committee of the Whole, and is this the second time now it's come before council? Like, this is the first time it's come to council. Was it presented at another meeting that I was not at?
Through the chair, I don't believe so. And there were 3 updates to council, and there was, I know when Aaron was here, one of the council updates that certainly did the recommendations had come forward. But in terms of seeing the plan all together, I believe that was at Committee of the Whole, as I recall.
So we saw the draft plan come at that point.
Correct.
My understanding in reading the correspondence from the community associations was they were looking to have us adopt it as the final version before we would accept the minutes of the Committee of the Whole meeting, indicating that that was the version we were working with, send it out to the community associations for input and feedback prior to us actually adopting it, because they weren't going to look at something that was in draft form yet. So I'm not sure I'm willing to look at adopting this at this point until we actually, we've heard from 2 community associations. Have the others even looked at it, given the process we laid out at the Committee of the Whole meeting? I don't know.
It had one of the most extensive public engagement processes that the District of Sechelt has seen, and with surveys and meetings and public meetings and Committee of the Whole. I think, again, if it was a bylaw, I would understand why the community associations would need a more direct referral, but I think staff has been bringing this forward for good reason. But it's there's no necessary reason to adopt a plan, except we need it for, as Councillor Inkster said, for making decisions. Councillor Mueller, your thoughts and recollections.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to raise some of the financial implications of the plan because I think it's really important for both council staff and also the community to be aware. When we have been doing our citizen satisfaction reviews, Parks consistently gets the highest citizen satisfaction. It's also in our operational spending where we spend most of our money. So I don't think that's any coincidence. And I think that we need to really be careful with the balancing. We have serious critical infrastructure needs that need to be addressed. And when we're moving forward with this, we need to make sure that we deal with those as well as dealing with our parks. It's my thought that in this budget, there's a lot of shifting that can be done within the parks area and free up money without going to taxes, because we know with our financial sustainability plan, all of the money that we're raising through taxes needs to go to critical infrastructure. So that's a caution to future councils and staff.
Thank you for that reminder. So to the issue of the second recommendation, do other councillors feel that it should be sent out for more community consultation, or are they satisfied that they can adjust with the letters and amend the plan to meet those needs?
I'll just move recommendation number 2.
Councillor Shanks moved and seconded by Councillor Lutz. Any further discussion? That the District of Sechelt Parks and Open Space Master Plan be adopted, and further discussion by Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. In the letters that we got from the community associations, it indicated that the plan that was laid out at the Committee of the Whole was that the draft, once it came to us here, would actually be referred out to the community associations for review before it came back to us for adoption. So given that was what was communicated to them at the Committee of the Whole at the beginning of this month, I don't believe we're actually following what we told them. So I can't support adopting it at this point until they've had the input. Even if we were to defer it back to staff, to the community associations, and come back to the next council meeting, I feel at least they'd have the opportunity at that point. Thanks.
Does anybody have our minutes from the Committee of the Whole? Councillor Mueller.
Well, I mean, I guess maybe we could just have another word from staff in terms of all of the consultation that's been done up to this point. I mean, I understand with a plan like this, it's fairly exhaustive and there's plenty of room to comment. But I could be wrong on that, looking to staff.
Through the chair, at the Committee of the Whole, there was discussion that we would refer it out, and that there would be a period of time to look at that, as well as getting input from council. So in terms of moving it forward with the consultant, we did receive edits from one of the groups that was sent on to the consultant, with some of the concerns noted, a lot of the typos, the text issues. There were some terminology issues got changed into the report. We didn't receive anything from any other community association. We had quite a bit of discussion both internally and with the consultants with regard to the mapping and the issue around how we identify the boundaries for community associations versus neighborhood plan areas. And they're usually kept separate for good reason. It does create some issues as you're doing what you've got in your OCP and what we use as a plan area in terms of infrastructure planning, land use planning. They're not always the same. They don't always have to line up. One doesn't negate the other. The issue with updating a lot of our maps at this time, I think council was aware we went well over budget on that one, mainly because we had some issues internally of being able to produce what was required just based on the trail mapping. To have the consultant change to reflect what was requested would require changing our base mapping in the GIS. They were not working on our they didn't have our GIS, they're working on our base mapping. It would require a fair bit of time and cost. It is unlikely this plan would come back this year in terms of moving it forward. So the discussion with the consultant was there is nothing in terms of what was being requested that would in any way kind of negate what the plan is proposing. And as we move forward on different updates to really to look at that through our implementation. So that was kind of this constraining aspect. The most recent came in very recently. It would have been very hard to turn around. But our contract is over. It would require additional funding. So it's just a question of if that is the requirement, we could find a way to make that happen, but I doubt we'd be able to get it back this year.
Thank you for that explanation. And that's, as I said at the beginning, the reason we don't change the maps. We will when we go through the next OCP review. We get our base maps changed, but those are not going to reflect more temporary changes of neighborhood social arrangements, and neighborhood associations come and go. So, Councillor Shanks, and sorry, a corporate officer would like to be noted and recognized.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to note if there was anything Council wished to reference from the August 1st Committee of the Whole meeting minutes, they're up there. Otherwise, I'll remove them. Just if there was anything special.
Do you want to scroll down?
Not sure.
Yeah, keep going. It'll come in the discussion afterwards. If there is, no, there won't be a motion because we don't make decisions at Committee of the Whole.
But there might have been some
There might have been some discussion at the end. Yeah. Okay. You want to just go, yeah, slow down.
Okay. Up though or down? Because we were down
back
at the
to
end.
the end, right there.
Finalization.
Once finalized, it would go back to Public Works, Parks and Environment Committee as opposed to coming here. That's the only real difference. It would have been another point of time. I really think we should look at this for what it is. It's a plan. It's not a bylaw. It's not a zoning bylaw. It's not anything that's going to, it's even more general than the OCP. So it's not going to require amendments, but we can make text amendments anytime we want. Councillor Mueller.
Yeah, I think just to be reminded of those minutes, the process we went through to this, it was a comprehensive engagement process. I think sometimes we get close to going in a circle around engagement, and on this one, I think we just have to move forward. The public comment has been open for months on this, so I'm pleased with it. I'm prepared to vote.
Yeah, not seeing any recommendation to defer to the associations. I'll have to support it as is.
So we have a motion in front of us and some discussion. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor? Those opposed? One opposed, and that's carried. And we can move to 10.5, which is a climate change accountability letter. We had a delegation come to us and submit written material asking us to present a letter that we could send off to the industry that was most directly impacted by impacting us in terms of climate change. So first, a motion to receive the report. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, Councillor Mueller. All those in favor? And the letter that was, we sent it back to staff to draft a letter. That's on page 447, attachment 1. It's a fairly brief letter. It gets to the point, but it doesn't. You'll notice some of the examples that came from Powell River and other places had multiple pages outlining the sins of the industry. This one just gets to the point that we see that they should be, in fact, part of the solution, and they share the responsibility for some of those costs. Councillor Seegers.
Minor change to the letter. Third line, remove the word including.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out what might have been intended. No, I think it's just a mistake, total mistake. Any other suggestions? That's why it was brought back to council, because it's going to go out on our behalf. Yeah, we'll have to look at the earlier drafts and see if there was a couple of words before that, before that, but I don't think there was. If there's no other suggestions, a motion, the second one, would that be directed to send the climate change accountability letter as amended? And this was another point of contention. Should it go to the 4 largest companies in British Columbia, or should it go around the world? And some of the suggestions were to send it to 90 to 100 companies around the world. Staff recommended just focusing on British Columbia and those that are bringing in fossil fuels to British Columbia. Yeah, local in that sense. Councillor Miller?
Yeah, I just wanted to note, this was of course brought forward by Citizens Actions Group, and council endorsed it, but this fall at UBCM, they are going to be debating a resolution on this with the whole body, which that could potentially carry some serious weight with it. I won't be attending UBCM, so I'm looking left and right to the councillors here that are, to definitely get a word in there. It's going to be interesting to see what the resource-dependent communities of the north do, because of course they're the ones that tend to vote against these types of things. But I'm wondering if the wildfire season of this past year has changed any minds or hearts of mayors in that area.
Thank you. And if council endorses this letter, that'll be the tone that we take at UBCM, which is more muted than some, but clear. Councillor Inkster?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think that Councillor Mueller is not, as he indicated, not going, which is unfortunate because this issue will come up, and for other reasons, unfortunate that he's not going, but I will speak if I have to. And the climate issue is one that, you know, we should discuss and bring up quite often, because not only is it about wildfires, but the climate issue is also about the amount of snow that falls in the winter that is stored up by Mother Nature to provide fresh water to our communities, and that's also been decreasing and not being stored, and longer, hotter summers, and we're having to deal with it as local governments, and it's not being discussed within our communities what climate change means for that issue as well. So it's important that we talk about these things. Thanks.
Okay, a motion to follow recommendation 2 with the letter as amended. Thank you. Actually, we have the motion on the floor. All those in favor? Carried. We have 15 minutes, and I'd like to get through the rest of the agenda without a special resolution to go past 10 o'clock, which is my intro to councillors' reports. You'll notice at the very end, question period is suspended because of it's been longstanding, I think, in the procedural bylaw that question period is suspended for meetings held between nomination day and regular voting day. Perhaps we should suspend councillor reports through the same period of time. But what I will say is let's keep our reports quick, brief, and non-political. Can I start on my left? Councillor Wright. Quick, brief, and non-political.
Thank you, Worship. Looking at the clock, I will be brief. And that concludes my report on the council.
Thank you. Councillor Seegers.
Sorry, I'm not going to be that short. Number of interesting groups I've met with in the last while. Dark Skies group, along with another number of the other councillors, I attended the reconciliation opening talk. Grand opening of Sunshine Tiny Homes, reception for the Chief Librarian, Shelley Archibald, summer barbecue, opening the Festival of Written Arts, Library Board meeting, Hackett Park Craft Fair, chamber luncheon, and a seniors planning table meeting with our MLAs, Nicholas Simons, Adam Olson, and Sonia Firstenow. Is that correct? I attended Elder College last night, and I want to commend staff, particularly the 2 who presented. They did an amazing job, but I also want to acknowledge the other staff who supported them, because I understand they did a couple of iterations of that with the other staff. So great job, and I'm looking forward to next week's. I just want to mention a couple of other things that I attended. Over the last probably 3 weeks, I've attended 3 celebrations of life, 2 here in the community, one for a young, a sister of one of our fellow councillors from the Sechelt Nation, and then a longtime community member, Ed Burnett, and then one of my cousins, actually. And then the final thing that I attended just this last week was my first medical assistance in dying process. So I attended with, and I just want to acknowledge the doctors and the nurses here on the coast, because there was a doctor and a nurse who attended, and their compassion and acceptance of the process and of the people and how people dealt with it was just, it was amazing. So it was a learning experience for me, and it was an honor actually to be there. So thanks.
Thank you for the report. Councillor Mueller.
Yeah, I did a number of things council related, but I'm just going to use my report to make a plug for Oktoberfest, September 29th on Cowrie Street. I'll be there again, cooking German food. All proceeds going to the SDBA. That's all I have to say.
Thank you for that report. Councillor Lutz.
Short and sweet. Most of the things that have been mentioned. Also, 2 Labor Day events, one in Sechelt and one in Gibsons. Very well attended, and appreciate the volunteers that did that work. Lots of photo ops, chamber lunch, and committee meetings. But best of all, I had 5 days with my granddaughter, and I also got to drum a drum with a drum circle at the Labor Day, and that was an honor.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Shanks?
I'll keep mine to a minimum as well, and I'll just focus on the fact that once again this year, our membership in the Coastas Car Club put on our Sleepy Hollow Rod Run and Car Show. We're down on the registrations to 356, down about 25 or 30, but the Rod Run had 472 participants, and we were at 427 last year. But once again, our car club came together and everything worked out extremely well, and the community is fortunate to be able to host that, and we thank the community for the support that they give us.
And we thank the car club for putting on such a great weekend. Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, just a couple of things. One is that I was also at Labor Day activities, although I didn't see one of the principal organizers because we crossed paths, seemingly. And I think the mayor was there, but I passed him on the highway. Busy day. And I also just wanted to mention a couple more things. One is I had a good conversation with the homeless shelter director, Mr. Gaskin, and had a lot of discussions on homelessness and where we're going in the future. And I think that this council needs to have a discussion, and future council needs to have a discussion on that issue in our community, because there's much more we can do. And that's one of the reasons why, with some encouragement from many friends in the community, I am just announcing that I'm running again in the fall election, and that's one of the issues I want us to work on, as well as our environment and continue to diversify our economy. And I just wanted to indicate that I'm continuing to bring ethical, accountable, honest governance to the table for the District of Sechelt Council, if elected. Thank you.
Going to tell us what position you're running for? Or are you going to hold that a secret for another week?
Well, I actually removed the word leadership, and I said governance. So there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Look forward to, that was a bit political, but we'll let it go. Let's move on to 11.2, the SCRD board. Council members have all announced, actually, in this council report when they're standing and or not standing, and I think that's important. And I think we're all accounted for now, as far as I can tell. And you're accounted for mostly. One more announcement, I think, coming up on the 8th. SCRD Board, we've had a break. Anything to report on our August time? And our 385-page agenda for tomorrow?
Thank you, Worship. No, the SCRD, as you know, breaks for August, and so there have been no committee meetings. Had Thursdays off all of August. And that concludes the SCRD report, unless you have something you want to add.
No, thank you very much. Let's move to council correspondence, and we do have a number of correspondence items, and some of them do need to be looked at. I've got a note here from our executive assistant who has gone through some of them. There is, again, an issue on the bollards. Their letter has been acknowledged. They seem to be asking for a specific council decision. Council has decided and made references, so we maybe just need to tell them that there's no action. The one that we do need to look at is the second one, the email and on the highway petition, because council said verbally that we thought that was a good idea, but staff would need direction if they're going to follow up on that. So the executive assistant has suggested wording for a motion if somebody would like to say that the District of Sechelt Council supports the local advocacy group SC 101, Sunshine Coast 101, in its petition to the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure to consider a bypass and work to resolve Lower Sunshine Coast Highway 101 traffic issues, and that a letter of support be prepared and forwarded to the group.
So moved.
One and a second. Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Any discussion of that? I think it's good to support if there's a local advocacy group. All those in favor? That's carried, and then the executive assistant will be happy. Any other correspondence that people would like? Well, first, a motion to receive the correspondence. I'm sorry, I'm slipping. Councillor Inkster, Councillor Shanks, all those in favor? We've dealt with two of them. Any others that we should deal with? The other one suggested was item 6, actually. Councillor Seegers, could you speak to that?
I like the idea that's brought forward, so I'd like to refer it to staff for review.
Yeah. Actually, we can do one better than that. Executive assistant has suggested that council direct staff to refer it to the SCRD and transit, because they'll look after the bus transit. So we go directly to,
perfect,
which is because that's actually where the decision will be made. Thank you, Councillor Seegers, for moving that staff ask council ask staff to refer Barry Pruden's bus stop idea to the SCRD Transit Committee. Seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That's carried. We've had direction on poaching, but they haven't actually, and no resolution, so that's been on a to-do list. I think that's just going to get done. Anything else, Councillor Seegers?
I'd like to see number 7 actually come back when we have some time to talk about it.
Yes.
That there's some information in there that I think we as a council need to review. And we have 3 minutes. It's not going to work tonight. Thanks.
And there are trends on regional growth in that package as well, which are important. So let's follow that up, which is basically a motion to refer that to the appropriate committee for discussion. And seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? That is an important one. Anything else? Motion to receive the RCMP monthly statistics and the Sechelt Visitor Services statistics. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Lutz. All those in favor? And any comments on those? Thank you for your patience. It was a very long evening. We did some substantive business. I'm looking, 2 minutes, 2. I'd look for a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Councillor Seegers. Seconded. All in favor? And question period has been suspended because we're in the nomination period, so let's go directly home and